in order to develop and create incredible experiences, generally there needs to be a lot of forethought and planning that has to go into something. So let me use sort of an example for you. So one of sort of the, options that we offer as a bank payment option allows for an instant deposit and then also allows for a closed loop withdrawal or an open loop withdrawal through the back end. So the experience itself is completely seamless for the customer. The reconciliation all takes place. Everything's done via API. It's a very low maintenance sort of option. However, to integrate both sort of the closed loop experience and the open loop experience, actually where we have the most sort of problems actually comes from sort of the development of resource in improving or being able to get that full sort of integration. There's platforms out there, certainly legacy platforms, whereby a payout is always an open loop payout, and a payout always involves, the collection of some data. It cannot just be an API call that fires something to their backend in order to authorize and confirm a transaction. It has to be actually manually driven by the actual player itself. So there's that huge amount of sort of frustration that gets built up there on sort of the payout side. And of course, obviously, if those platforms wanted to sort of change something, it would involve actually changing the way that their platform thinks sometimes in order to be able to deploy such an experience. So that costs money, and obviously sort of the kind of the finance department, if you're, a head of product, if you're the COO, if you are one of those people that's really being tasked to sort of deliver, a great experience in a certain budget, a certain time frame, etc., sometimes things get cut loose. So you ultimately end up with a product sometimes that gets half integrated, what we call sort of almost half baked, and it's not necessarily as good as it possibly can be, but that cost there is a time. We went back to sort of time, as being really a real cost contributor. That's the real sort of cost of something, right? So those sorts of things can cause really a lot of friction. One of the examples that we actually made in sort of the build up as well was, we're talking about sort of cost here. I had a recent experience. It was Saturday morning. I'd just woken up. I'm 33 years old. I'm starting to think about, my pension, which sounds odd, right? I cannot imagine 23-year-old me waking up on a Saturday morning thinking about these sorts of things. But I actually have a legacy. Actually, I've got a couple of providers, but I got a legacy sort of platform provider, right? It's a big name in the UK. I sort of got packaged up and sold a sort of package deal by sort of a financial advisor, so I sort of purchase insurance through them as well. I go to obviously, access the platform. It is online, so they're not, that backwards. I go to obviously make a deposit or a payment, what we would call sort of funding in financial services, but deposit obviously in iGaming. And obviously at a certain amount, Visa and MasterCard is not allowed, right? Because of the actual processing cost of being able to process a fee there. So you're given an option to send a bank payment. And there is such a huge amount of anxiety, by the time I've worked all of those things out, that's 20, 25 minutes that sort of has come to sort of making this purchasing decision in the first place. And then there's another 5-10 minutes of sort of uncertainty. And then also it's not even going to be confirmed from their side immediately, even though the payment scheme is instant because it has to be manually reconciled as to whether or not that money has actually been accepted. So that cost there is me as a customer, because in the back of my mind, I have another platform called Invest Engine. I have my ISA with them, but I don't necessarily have my pension with them. And, on their platform, they have a really fantastic open banking experience, which is driven by TrueLayer. So shout out to Roberto Villani. I'm not sure if he did that deal, but there's obviously others over there. And they have a fantastic open banking experience. It manually reconciles immediately, and the funds get credited immediately into my account, and then I can literally purchase, the shares, or the shares then get executed. Maybe not that same day, depending on the day. Obviously, if it's a Saturday, you need to wait for the markets to open again on Monday for trading to start, for those shares to be executed. But that whole sort of anxiety, friction, ease of use. Now, it probably costs Invest Engine probably more to accept Truelow, right, in comparison to, that manual bank payment option to some undescripted account. But that uncertainty and potentially losing me as a customer is a far higher cost than not being able to accept me as a customer. So there has to be some sort of recognition and understanding that actually cost is not really the top thing that we should be thinking about. It always has to go back to the customer, and unfortunately the customer generally is always right, because the customer will always end up finding really a point of least resistance, right, of least friction. It would be almost like paying for your utilities sort of manually every month. And this still happens. My wife's father actually pays in cash for his utilities, right? he still does that in America. And whereas sort of a direct debit or an ACH, as it would be over in the States, would certainly suffice. And I just cannot imagine having to take time out of my day to go and do something like that. So that's like, I would just go and find another provider, even if it was more expensive, for me to use that product. So that's the real expense of something, and the actual cost of payment, which really drives, I think, the real sort of, cost of acquisition, etc.